SPJIMR's Center for Wisdom and Leadership presents its podcast series called Past Imperfect.
You're listening to Past Imperfect, a history podcast brought to you by the Center for Wisdom and Leadership at SPJIMR. I'm Dinyar Patel. What do Lata Mangeshkar, Sadhus, a cartoon about aliens, and a globe-trotting superstar professor all have in common? They are part of the incredible, oftentimes zany story of India's experiments with a planned economy. Nikhil Menon, a professor from Notre University in the United States, joins us today to discuss his new book, Planning Democracy. This book looks at India's first five-year plans, their preeminent architect, Prasanta Chandra Mahalanobis, and the Nehruvian state's attempts to make economic planning democratic. Thank you, Nikhil, for joining us today.
Thank you so much, Dinyar, for inviting me. It's a pleasure to be here.
So your book, Planning Democracy, a lot of it covers basically a god who failed. Prasanta Chandra Mahalanobis, a brilliant, globally acclaimed statistician who, while in the Planning Commission, was the principal architect of the second five-year plan, which, of course, spectacularly flopped. It's in many ways a cautionary tale about experts and expertise. And we're currently living in a very anti-intellectual, anti-elite, anti-expert moment in time, whether we're here in India or the United States, or as Boris Johnson has recently proved to us, the United Kingdom as well. What lessons about experts and expertise should we read? And in a similar vein, what lessons should we not read into the story of Mahalanobis and the early years of the Planning Commission?
Thanks, Dinyar. And if you don't mind, if I can just sort of color in a little bit detail about Mahalanobis, just for your listeners who might not be as familiar with him. As you suggested, he was seen as a god by some in the 1950s. He was one of the most influential Indians of his generation. He had this interest in statistics that began quite by accident when he completed a degree in physics at Cambridge University in the early 1900s, around the First World War. And then while returning by ship to India, to Calcutta, he picks up this book on statistics. And so a sort of lifelong association with statistics begins. But for the next few decades in India, he's a lecturer of physics back at Presidency College, but also a statistician on the side. He founds the reputed Indian Statistical Institute in 1931. And by the time of independence, Mahalanobis is celebrated for his contributions to sample surveys, which come to be increasingly used across the world. And over the next 2 decades, till the end of his life, Mahalanobis would then design the National Sample Survey, which we still use till today, the Central Statistical Organization, which we still have till today. And he brought India its first 2 digital computers as well, apart from, as you said, designing India's a hugely crucial second five-year plan, which, though it might have failed, was still the broad template that India's economic policy followed to liberalization, in terms of strategy at least, in the 1990s. So a hugely important figure and quite a fascinating character as well. Now, coming to your question about expertise and the issues with it, I think that you're right to point that we are part of a what seems to be a sweeping trend across the globe of a backlash against expertise. But my view is that we don't really have a choice about whether or not to rely on expertise, especially in modern complex societies with the level of specializations that we have in different fields. The challenge, though, to me is how do we combine a democracy that is able to keep a check on that expertise with ensuring that that expertise is working towards common good. And a parallel challenge is to cultivate a political culture in which this expertise is also respected, right? So you have a popular legitimacy and democracy checking expertise, but also a popular culture in which these experts are respected and given some deference in their fields. I think that a lot of this anti-expertise backlash comes from populist movements across the world that are actually anti-elite, as most populist movements are, perhaps definitionally. And because experts are seen as part of an entrenched elite, their expertise is seen as being tarnished or corrupted by being a part of this group. And so to me, the long-term answer is not to turn away from expertise, but rather to democratize the access to higher education and specialization so that citizens do not associate experts with a certain entrenched social group, but that actually see it as a position that anyone could theoretically have access to. And I think that once you decouple certain social groups with having most of your experts or almost all your experts coming from them, I think that might sever this sort of this toxic link between the elite and the expert, and so therefore, if being anti-elite does not necessarily mean being anti-expert.
That's an interesting point. I mean, in India, I think we're pretty far away from that state where perhaps there's a decoupling of, say, the elite and an elite technocratic group that is formulating policy. And in the United States, it seems in many ways we're going backwards, right? In the sense
Yeah. I mean, I did say it is the long-term answer to me.
And there's some interesting parallels here also. Because, I mean, around the same time in the United States, you had under Kennedy and later on with LBJ, you had these kind of brain trust groups, right? Experts coming in from Harvard, or people like McNamara coming from Ford, and this massive collection of intelligence. And what you have as a result is spectacular failure, right? I mean, you had the Vietnam War, you had mismanagement of elements of the economy. I mean, there's an interesting link over here between massive brain trust and not always getting the results that you intend.
I mean, I'd say that there's also a risk of overdrawing that conclusion, because I think that the failure is not necessarily because of the expertise. I think that there are also numerous cases where expertise basically keeps economies afloat, and where lack of expertise, such as, say, in the Soviet economy, or, for example, with demonetization in India, results in just catastrophic failure, right? So I don't think that the correlation necessarily always means causation as well. And so I think that a reliance entirely on expertise can be problematic, but also I think that we need to recognize, and experts need to be humble about the fact that knowledge is also something that can change. The views on the economy that most development economists had in the 1950s are not shared by most development economists today. So expertise is also not a static thing, and I think that we, as human societies, we can only try to go by the best lights of the expertise we have, but we need to know that that expertise can be flawed as well. And I think that in the profession of economics, at least, it seems that the mainstream view, which was pro-planning, which was pro-import substitution in the 1950s, and reflected the then dominant view of global development economists at the time as well, was by the mid-1960s already being challenged. And I think a bigger question in India is that why did India not move along with that trend? As planning economies across the world moved in a different direction towards export-led economies.
Even though, as you point out, there were many opposition figures like B.R. Shenoy, or even the politician Minu Masani, who were campaigning against planning at the time, and were in touch with people who were kind of pushing against that developmentalist model that had been around from the 1930s onward.
Absolutely. I think that those are important figures in our history, and I think that there is more scholarship being unearthed about them. But I think that they are also more marginal figures. Politically, they were more marginal. Minu Masani, Raja GC, Rajagopalachari, the part of the founders of the Swatantra Party. But it is a party that doesn't really rival the Congress Party, is not a national party in quite the same way. And the economists that you mentioned, the B.R. Shenoy, others from the so-called Bombay group, B.R. Brahmananda, and C.N. Vakil, also proven in some ways to be right about some of their critiques of the second five-year plan, but were also marginal even within the economics profession at the time, right? So I think that their presence alone does not mean that they were the dominant voices in their profession. But I think that those are very important figures, and I think that over time, I think the economics profession came to realize that those are figures that perhaps the establishment in India, political and otherwise, was very harsh in their dismissal. Priya Brahmananda, for example, talks about how being critical of the second five-year plan led to him sometimes being branded as anti-national or even a CIA agent. Sort of ludicrous criticisms of that sort. Though funnily enough, he did not have any sort of personal antipathy towards Mahalanobis himself, who he refers to as a sort of man, a brilliant man with sort of fresh ideas. But the kind of consensus that built around Mahalanobis and the second five-year plan did become an orthodoxy that did not brook any opposition.
Tell us a little bit more about how you chose to write your dissertation and your book on planning. How did you stumble upon this particular idea, and how did your project take its course during your grad school years?
Right. Yeah. I mean, I don't know about you, Dinyar, but I did not have a very clear idea when I began my PhD about
Neither
what
did I.
topic.
I don't think anyone does.
All right. Okay. Well, I think some do, and I'm very envious of them. But I actually entered my PhD with having done an MPhil at JNU with a very different subject. And when I went to the United States, I used the fact that there's a longer PhD to sort of think about other ideas, think about a story that might be more national than the research I'd been doing earlier. And the idea of planning came to me because I was interested in the Indian economy. I was interested in the story of the Indian economy, and there was a sort of mainstream view about planning, but that story seemed to be told mostly by social scientists. It was, memoirs by economists from that time, or writings by contemporary economists about the 5-year plans and about the early plans. And I just felt that even while growing up in the early 1990s and in the 90s, you still would read about the 5-year plans. They were in the newspapers, they were still covered, and they were seen as important. But it didn't give me a sense of why planning was once considered something that was seen as avant-garde, as seen as the bleeding edge of modernization in India. And there seemed to be in the 1950s a romance about the idea of planning, which by the 2000s has sort of utterly faded. Right? It's a sort of empty shell of what planning as an idea was once thought of as being. And I think that I want to write a history that recovered, not to justify, but recovered for the sake of comprehension what the romance with the idea was.
So, can you tell our listeners a little bit about the challenges that you faced when researching this project? I know in your book you talk about the difficulties in accessing Nehru's papers after independence, and I faced them as well when I've tried to do research on that era. And you mention also that many of the files of the Planning Commission were likely burned or destroyed by clerks, thrown away. Any archival research in India is difficult, but it seems that researching post-independence India is particularly difficult.
I don't know if it is more difficult. I haven't researched many other parts of India. I've researched some colonial India for my MPhil, and so I have some sense of how it is there. But you yourself, Dinyar, have written about the challenges of archive-based history in India. The challenges that you faced even when studying, colonial India, 19th century onwards. And I should say that this is a common complaint amongst us historians of India, particularly independent India, perhaps, since we also have to deal with the sort of official 30-year prohibition on accessing government records, which is pretty standard across the world. So, for example, official documents from today might only be available to historians in 2050, right? With regard to the Planning Commission, I was quite shocked when I went to the archive, given how powerful the Planning Commission was. It was virtually like another ministry, right? A ministry that rivaled, in fact, sometimes overshadowed the finance ministry. I was shocked at how paltry the archival record was, given the size and importance of this institution. And actually, another scholar, Vivek Chibbar, who has written about planning as a sociologist, came to the conclusion, having done some research in the early 2000s and having had access, according to his own writings, to the personal contacts to the finance ministry and even perhaps the prime minister's office. He came to the conclusion that having gone to the ministries themselves and looked at their records to see if so there were some files that were left there and not transferred to the archives, his conclusion that some of these documents were just disposed of by clerks because they were not seen as important. And I think that for the historians that are listening, I think that one of the reasons might be that there isn't a continuity in the case of the Planning Commission with the colonial era. So, for example, the Ministry of Finance and the Ministry of External Affairs had corollaries in the colonial government, whereas the Planning Commission is an entirely new department. So perhaps there weren't systems in place to continue with the record keeping of the Planning Commission. But it presented a major challenge, and one that I will admit, caused a fair deal of anxiety, because what do you do if the subject that you're studying, the main institution, you do not seem to have the mother load of the archival vein. Well, what I did is that, and with regard to the Nehru papers, as you said, while the edited series of the selected works of Nehru's are fantastic, they are, after all, selected works, and they're not the complete works. And at least when I was doing the research in 2013 onwards, you still had to get permission from Sonia Gandhi's office in order to access some of these files of Nehru's post-independence. I believe, having recently gone to the Nehru Library as well, I believe that has been opened up a fair deal now, and a lot more scholars are now getting access to these documents. Yet, one of the problems that persist is that though these papers are voluminous and extremely rich, they are still only indexed by date and not by subject. And so you could spend weeks in the Nehru papers and get through just a few days of his correspondence and not know what you're looking at. So it's still, looking like searching for a needle in a haystack. So the way that I went about doing the research is by trying to access the private papers of many of the people involved with planning, such as Mahalanobis, whose papers are across Delhi and Calcutta, C.D. Deshmukh, who was the finance minister of India, but also a member of the Planning Commission, Gulzarilal Nanda, who was the Minister of Planning and also a member of the Planning Commission, and trying to supplement those with government documents from the National Archives, reports and memoranda from international organizations like the Ford Foundation, US State Department records, some of which I found in Cambridge. And for the second half of the book, which is on democratic planning and how plans were publicized, I consulted movies, plays, songs, novels, in order to try to reconstruct the popular culture of the time.
I think what you say about the lack of continuity is absolutely correct. I mean, at least with regard to a lot of post-independence institutions, one notices, I mean, at least I've noticed when I've done some research in the archives, is that things are pretty well organized until around 1940 something, maybe 1941, 42. And once, the war is in full gear, and especially as independence is looming, the organization seems to fall apart. And I remember from being at the National Archives, about 10 years ago when Musharraf Hassan was still director, he had, I guess, a bit more leeway with ministers and ministries than other directors. So you'd have these huge carts of rotting paper being transported in the back of tempos, and they'd literally be flying in the wind and be dumped at the front door of the National Archives. And you'd look at these documents and you realize, like, oh, well, this is the Home Department records from the 1951 or 52. And I assume that lack of continuity that the Planning Commission suffered from is one reason why even the records of that were not properly maintained institution, leave alone transferred to its proper place at the National Archives.
Yeah, I mean, I think that, as you say, this is a huge issue because it's now ad hoc, right? As you and I know, being at the National Archives, the one thing that all researchers that dread is getting a slip back that says NT, which is not transferred, which means, for those who haven't done research at the National Archives, it means that it has not been transferred from the relevant ministry. And as you were pointing out, this is something that you as a researcher, you don't know when it has been transferred or not. And you don't know whether it will ever be transferred or not, or if the documents are even there anymore at the ministry for them to be transferred in the future. And it's just this one sort of big black hole that as a researcher, you have no access into. And I think that there is a way in which, oddly, the post-independence in Indian state is not as good as the colonial state in record keeping, and not as concerned about record keeping as the colonial state is. I mean, one can understand the challenges of starting up a new state, but I think a part of what happens is that the lack of continuity, perhaps even in personnel, certainly in systems, means that this is a subject that is not seen as very important, which leads to these sort of big gaping holes in the archival record. Now, I think that historians who work on different periods, for example, in the 16th century in India, will say, well, at least you have a hell of a lot of documents to look at still, as opposed to the much more narrow documentary base that historians in different time periods work with. So I think that there's some aspect of which in which us historians of each period find the grass greener on the other side. But I think that perhaps in the future, the bigger challenge that is looming is what happens once you enter the digital era, right? Once you want to study the 1990s and 2000s, once there isn't a paper record anymore, are these servers being maintained? Are the servers that have historical records of prime ministerial or ministerial correspondence being maintained? Will historians be given access to them without them being scrubbed in some way? How long will these digital records remain? Or will people just hit delete on all of it? And then what does one do as a historian?
Absolutely. I mean, as it is, we have no real access to Indira Gandhi's papers, right? And if there ever is a collection of the Narendra Modi papers, one wonders what is in it and what is it will be kept deliberately out of it.
Right. And are they papers anymore?
Absolutely. Yeah.
Right.
Yeah. I mean, you describe Indian record keeping as a black hole, and I think that's an appropriate metaphor in many ways. So I want to move on a little bit to planning and Mahalanobis in particular. Can you tell us a little bit about the historical roots of Indian planning? What were some of the global influences? What were some of the antecedents to planning before the first 5-year plan began in 51?
Yeah, there very much were global influences. I think that you might go back as far as the latter half of the 19th century to a period in which people in Asia are realizing that a centralized state can move a backward economy and sort of fillip it towards modernization. So I think that one of the important events is the Meiji Restoration in Japan in 1868. Later on, which gives a sense of what an Asian economy can do with the centralized state. Then you have this in the Soviet Union. You have the 5-year plan in 1928. In America, in the early 1930s, during the Great Depression, you have the New Deal, and then with the Second World War, you have even the colonial government in India engaging a planning department, setting up a planning department. So planning in India by the 1930s and 40s was seen as quite a mainstream idea. The idea that the state would play an important role in directing the economy was not seen as necessarily even anti-capitalist, because even capitalist economies such as that of America under FDR was engaging in it. And support for planning, therefore, became it's somewhat it's somewhat spanned the political spectrum. So, amongst scientists, supporters of planning included the civil engineer M. Visvesvaraya, who was then on the board of Tata Iron and Steel. Another scientist was the astrophysicist Meghnad Saha, who was another big supporter of planning. People who were seen as modernists like Rabindranath Tagore was excited at the prospect. There was even support amongst Indian industrialists like G.D. Birla, J.R.D. Tata, Lala Shriram. In 1934, in fact, G.D. Birla stands up and speaks at FICCI, at the Federation of Indian Chambers of Commerce and Industry, speaks to these assembled capitalists and makes a plea for planning. In the 1940s, then you have plans that are of different stripes that are proposed by the Congress, by communists, by businessmen in the Bombay Plan, by Gandhians, and even by the Muslim League. So, so when the Congress sets up the National Planning Committee, which is headed by Jawaharlal Nehru, as determined by the then president of the Congress Party, Subhash Chandra Bose, the Congress's National Planning Committee offices in Bombay through the 1940s were housed in buildings owned by the Tatas. In fact, J.R.D. Tata was invited to a couple of meetings of the National Planning Committee as well. So it was not necessarily seen as so left-wing that industrialists would not be on board with the ideas of planning. And I think that planning, we have to also think of in terms of not just international influences, but how planning was adopted in countries across the world from the 1940s. So, for example, in the mid-1940s, Britain's Labour Party, which comes to power in 1945, its manifesto that rides it into power talks about having planning in the British state. So then you have the government in charge of the largest empire in the world declaring its belief in economic planning. The Soviet Union and China, of course, we know, had planned economies, but so did South Korea, and so did Japan, so did Vietnam, Malaysia, France, Mexico, Argentina. In Africa, there were more than 20 countries that had planned economies. I think that what made Indian planning unique and made Indian planning different was this idea of, and we can debate how true it was this idea of democratic planning, and that in which India was going to try to combine parliament with 5-year plans, try to combine this idea during the Cold War that were pitted against each other, that of a free liberal democracy along with that of centralized economic planning, and that India was going to offer this as a new model in the Cold War for decolonizing nations. I think that is the pitch that India made to the world. That was what made Indian planning unique.
It seemed like a really bold idea, especially since many of the real supposedly successful examples of planning were, say, the Soviet Union or even the economic policies pursued by people like Hitler or Mussolini and totalitarian states. So, I mean, democratic planning seemed to be something that was completely revolutionary in many ways.
Yes, and in the East, also under an authoritarian government in South Korea. South Korea also has a very successful planned economy in the 1960s, 70s, but a lot of it happens under an authoritarian state as well. And maybe we can discuss this later, but the difference in the Chinese model that sort of really gets turbocharged in the 1980s and in the South Korean or Japanese or Vietnamese model is that those are export-led planned economies as opposed to ours, which is sort of import substitution based economy.
So you paint a very rich and entertaining portrait of Mahalanobis, a man who was simply known as the professor and who seemed to possess a titanic self-confidence about his own expertise on a variety of topics. Can you tell us a little bit more about his personality and how precisely he came to dominate discussion on planning in India?
Yeah, I mean, I found Mahalanobis to be an utterly fascinating figure. He was not someone who, I mean, he's someone I knew about, and I knew that he would play a part in the story, but I didn't quite realize how important he would be to one half of this book until I delved into the records. I think Titanic self-confidence is an appropriate way of putting it. I refer to him through the book as the professor because I realized that most of his contemporaries, when they were talking about him, referred to him just as the professor. And sometimes they said the professor in Calcutta says such and such. But more entertainingly, I found that sometimes Mahalanobis would sign off his own correspondence just with the professor or professor, right? Not writing Professor Mahalanobis, just professor. So Mahalanobis was born in 1893 in Calcutta, in colonial Calcutta. And he grew up in this very culturally refined household and milieu. He was trained in his undergraduate years in physics, where he was educated at Presidency College in Calcutta. Then he goes to King's College at Cambridge University, where he befriends the sort of mathematical genius Srinivasan, who was then also at Cambridge. He was brilliant. He is a charismatic figure. He is a very serious man. And he is, as you said, titanically self-confident and self-assured. He is, he's quite in some ways, a polymath. He is, well versed in ancient Sanskrit texts. He is an expert on Bengali poetry, especially that of Rabindranath Tagore's. He even dabbles in architecture, though his colleagues at the Indian Statistical Institute say that he was not the best architect, but no, he wasn't really one to ask for advice. But he was also someone who was animated by a sense of purpose. He wanted his academic work to matter outside the academy. He wanted it to matter for nation building. And the reason that I think Mahalanobis emerges out of statistics into policy making is partly due to this desire, but partly also due to some structural factors. Now, the common view about Mahalanobis, which I push back against in my book, is that Mahalanobis was allowed to influence economic policy because of his proximity to Nehru. The argument basically is that Nehru and Mahalanobis were friends, and so Mahalanobis became India's foremost planner. And I find that really unsatisfactory as an explanation. I find that too personality-centric on Nehru and Mahalanobis. They weren't family members, they weren't even close friends from their youth. And there were many, many other economists in the country and many other technocrats that Nehru was familiar with, and many other economists that he was familiar with. So as I argue in the book, the reason that I find is more structural. To me, the answer for why Mahalanobis comes to play such an important role is that centralized planning required huge masses of data about the economy, data that India lacked. You have this as a constant refrain amongst planners in India from the late 1930s onwards. Then, as now, there existed this somewhat utopian view that if only we had adequate data, the solution would be apparent. And at a time like that, Mahalanobis and the Indian Statistical Institute offered ways by which planners could accumulate this data that they felt they lacked. Why? Because Mahalanobis and the Indian Statistical Institute were at the very forefront of statistics in India. Mahalanobis was once described as a presiding genius of statistics in India. He was, in fact, one of the leading statisticians in the world. And he helped set up the Central Statistical Organization, the National Sample Survey. And so it is in that context in which centralized planning needs data, and Mahalanobis and the Indian Statistical Institute in Calcutta come to represent the people that can deliver that data, that Mahalanobis comes to be associated with planning, and then Mahalanobis was never one to require a second invitation.
In many ways, his quest for data is quite similar to what you have nowadays, right? Which I think you talk about in the book, this search for big data, the ability to kind of fill in all the blanks with information of one sort or the other.
Yes, absolutely. I think that there is, and this debate it recurs with, with Aadhaar, with, national level biometrics. The idea that as long as you just had enough data about people, that all the sort of all of the policy thinking just stops there. The delivery of services, etc., is not seen as important as just accumulating data just for data's sake. And so data was seen as important across the world in the 1950s. We must remember that this is the first decade in which computers are spreading across the world. In fact, Mahalanobis brings two of the earliest digital computers to Asia outside of Japan. No other country had a digital computer, and Mahalanobis managed to bring the first two digital computers, which are, by the way, huge, not like computers you see and imagine today. The laptops on which we're recording this have perhaps more computing power than these huge hulking beasts that Mahalanobis brings to the campus of the Indian Statistical Institute in Calcutta, where they occupy an entire room on campus. But there is a sense that this data has a liberatory potential, that if this data is unlocked, that India can plan its economy and that it can lead to transformations in the state of India's economy. And I don't know if that really bears out. But on the other hand, it does mean that this huge sort of fire hose of data that is coming from the National Sample Survey can theoretically be calculated. And also, we must remember that these computers that do come to Calcutta, ostensibly for the purpose of calculating sample survey data for the plans, were also used by other institutes. Because what would happen is that, for example, IIT Bombay or the Atomic Research Center under Homi Bhabha would contract 4 hours of the computer's time in Calcutta to run, calculations or tabulations for all kinds of other questions as well.
I want to go back to those economists you mentioned. You talked about how Nehru was, very well aware of other leading economists with different ideas, and indeed there was quite a healthy debate in India about what type of economic models should be pursued post-independence. How did Mahalanobis sideline or discredit or co-opt, if that's an appropriate term to use, so many of these individuals? I find it remarkable that everyone from Amartya Sen to Jagdish Bhagwati got their start in the Mahalanobis camp.
Yes, and that's quite an ideological range, right? Today we know that Amartya Sen and Jagdish Bhagwati are seen as sort of polar opposites in terms of their recommendations for the economy and their views on the economy. But there was a time where the Planning Commission, the ideas of the 5-year plans, the idea of a developmentalist centralized state pursuing broadly socialistic ideas in which India would pursue import substitute industrialization, was seen as very mainstream. And so, as you point out, there was in the late 1950s, Amartya Sen, Manmohan Singh, and Jagdish Bhagwati, who occupy different positions on the economic spectrum, all in some ways worked for or agreed with the work of the Planning Commission. We must remember that they were economists of a younger generation, and as Jagdish Bhagwati says, that a lot of them were sort of seduced by the ideas that Mahalanobis was proposing. Mahalanobis was seen as this great modernizer that could help deliver India into modernity. I recount an anecdote that Jagdish Bhagwati talks about how he was a postdoctoral fellow at Oxford University, and the professor came visiting, and the professor asked Jagdish Bhagwati to come back to his country to help with India's progress. And Bhagwati says that I was happy to be one of the professor's boys. And so he comes back and works in the ISI campus in Delhi for the Planning Commission. I think that the way in which Mahalanobis is able to come to this position of prominence is that, and I talk about this in the book, is that to some degree, the ideas he's proposing have some backing amongst Indian economists as well. And so, for example, when there's a panel of economists that a draft version of the second 5-year plan is put to, amongst 21 economists, there's only one dissenting vote, and that is of B.R. Shenoy, who you mentioned. And so there is a way in which the views of Mahalanobis are also shared by that of others. And when he had opposing views in India, I talk about in the book how he used support from economists or academics abroad as a way to neutralize them, right? I talk about how Mahalanobis was spent a good deal of the year traveling abroad in the summer to different countries, making connections with academics, and very often inviting them to come to Calcutta and work at Calcutta for the Statistical Institute or for the Planning Commission. And that was the one way in which he neutralized opponents and detractors both at home and abroad. I talk about, and I quote from a letter that he writes to his friend and associate Pitambar Pant back in Calcutta at the time, and he's writing from I believe it is from Europe or from Moscow, and in a very uncharacteristic moment, Mahalanobis sounds very vulnerable. He says that he has no training in formal economics, and that it makes him feel a bit insecure around economists who are trained in their textbooks, but he believes that they are wrong, and that getting the support from that, actually coming abroad, seeing that people here agree with him, makes him sort of straightens his spine when he comes back and he has to do battle with his domestic detractors.
He seems in many ways like a master of academic politics. He actually made academic politics quite relevant for the country in general.
Absolutely. I mean, as one statistician put it, no statistician perhaps ever attended as many international conferences as Mahalanobis. And I mean, this was not just international academic schmooze. He was, as you said, using it for policy purposes. He was using these connections that he was making, and he was making these connections because he was associated with policy making in India, but also he was a globally respected scientist, right? He had been, before this association with the government, before independence even, he had been made a fellow of the Royal Society for his contributions to statistics. So he was a respected statistician, seen as contributing cutting edge methods to sample surveys, which were beginning to be used across the world. And so that gave him an aura of respectability and legitimacy. And the fact that with that, his institute in Calcutta was combining statistics with econometrics and studies for the planned economy, and access to people like C.D. Deshmukh in Delhi and Nehru in Delhi gave him a sort of standing when he went to these conferences abroad, which he was able to use, as we just discussed, in order to solidify his position in policymaking back in the corridors of Yojana Bhavan in Delhi.
I want to talk a little bit about the National Sample Survey, which you describe in great detail. It's something which, as you mentioned, the American statistician W. Edwards Deming, a person who most people know as being the guru of total quality management, was absolutely astounded by. And you talk about how the challenges which some of the first data collectors faced while in the field included everything from man-eating tigers to people from Adivasi backgrounds who didn't quite understand the modern meaning of money. Could you tell us a little bit more about how the survey worked?
Yeah, absolutely. The National Sample Survey is an institution that was started by the post-colonial Indian government in collaboration with the Indian Statistical Institute and Mahalanobis. In fact, for its first few years, a lot of the most important posts were occupied by people from the Indian Statistical Institute itself. A majority of the survey design was designed in Calcutta by the Indian Statistical Institute. So it really was a contribution that came from Calcutta rather than from Delhi. And it is used till today. Till today, the way that India measures its employment, poverty, a lot of these figures about household income, etc., comes from the National Sample Survey, which happens with regularity, though there's some controversy about certain studies being discontinued or watered down more recently. And in the words, Nobel Prize-winning economists like Angus Deaton have said that this was where Mahalanobis led, the rest of the world followed, because of the fact that it was seen as near impossible that you could have sample surveys conducted at this scale, representing from such a small sample a country as vast as India. And the fact that India was able to do it, and able to do it with rigor and consistency, led to a lot of these methods being adopted by the World Bank and the United Nations, such that today the World Bank surveys, household surveys that are conducted in more than 100 countries, include methods that were pioneered by the Indian Statistical Institute in Calcutta. So the National Sample Survey was really a revolution in India's data capacities. It began in 1950, and the idea was to begin this really sprawling set of nationwide surveys to capture information on different aspects of India's and its citizens' economic life. And the logic of a sample survey is that since it would be really quite impossible or too expensive to collect statistics from every single household across the nation, I mean, India's population at this time is close to 400 million, that it was better instead to develop a representative small sample from which the whole could be calculated, right? That you calculate the whole from a small fraction. It was quite literally the biggest and most
And
comprehensive.
of course, that's where
Yes.
compute. Oh, sorry. Go ahead. Go ahead.
Yes, and that computers very quickly would become crucial to this. And so this was like the biggest and most comprehensive sample inquiry ever done in the world. And the challenges, as you said, were enormous. I mean, there were 560,000 villages in India at the time, and the sample that was chosen was 1,800 villages. The statistical institute was short-staffed. They needed to negotiate 15 languages. Many different local systems of measurement needed to be standardized. And as you said, Mahalanobis in his diary, would talk about going to these investigators going to the forested areas in Orissa with armed guards because they had to go through forests. They had to go past snow-clad Himalayan passes. They encountered tribals who did not understand any of the languages that they were speaking. They fell ill due to tropical diseases, and they also feared for their lives in these forests because of man-eating tigers. But the results were quite extraordinary, giving this amazing detail about the daily life of Indians, which would not matter so much if it just told us about the daily life of Indians in just those 1,800 villages. But because they were a representative sample, you could therefore project what the life of the average Indian was in different parts of India. And we benefit from this national sample survey till today.
It reminds me in many ways of the Great Indian Trigonometrical Survey from the colonial era.
Right.
Obviously, it takes a much shorter period of time, but you have this massive data collecting effort where people die, right? I mean, thousands of people die doing this survey to basically discover the elevation of the Himalayas or the elevations of parts of the Western Ghats and such. So India has a pretty long history of these quite daring, comprehensive endeavors for data collection.
Absolutely.
So in the second half of your book, you focus on this concept called democratic planning, a term which you point out was used by Nehru as early as 1939. What precisely was this, and how is it a contradiction of sorts?
Yes. So the second half, as you say, of my book is devoted to this. Moves away from this technocratic idea of planning, which puts in center stage people like Mahalanobis, to this idea of democratic planning, which I found quite intriguing. And I found references to it, going back to the 1940s. In fact, as early as 1939, in Nehru's handwriting. The idea of democratic planning seems to have been that Indian planning was fundamentally different from communist planning because, one, India was a democracy in which India could not use the stick in order to ensure that people acted according to the wishes of the planners in Delhi. And secondly, because Indians had the vote, and so theoretically, every 5 years, Indians could decide to vote out the government because of their economic policies, right? So that this was part of the democratic planning. But aside from this, there were also more idealistic notions associated with democratic planning. And that notion was that people like Nehru and others in the Planning Commission had the view that democracy and citizenship fully came into practice only when citizens not only enjoyed the fruits of being a citizen, but participated, were aware of what the country was engaged in, and participated in the great challenges of the duties of citizenship. Right? That citizenship came with duties and obligations as well, and the duties and obligations included voluntarily participating in the challenge of economic development. And so Nehru would often talk about democratic planning as therefore this was what separated Indian planning from Chinese planning, or it separated Indian planning from Soviet planning. And so it had this kind of rose-tinted element which sort of smacks of Nehruvianism, this idea that India had new citizens, and these new citizens would be a part of the development project by being a part of democratic planning, not just by sitting at home and listening to people talk about what the 5-year plans were, or reading newspaper about what it was, or having people at their sort of local panchayat meeting or something, or the gram panchayat meetings telling them about what these Panchvarsha yojanas were, but that they would actually pick up a spade or, and help in a local embankment scheme, or in help in voluntarily building along with their fellow villagers a dispensary, etc. So I think that is this romantic aspect and idealistic aspect of democratic planning is one part of it. But I think to others on the Planning Commission, and perhaps Nehru as well, there was also a more realistic reason for talking about democratic planning, which is that India had very limited state capacity. India had these very ambitious 5-year plans, but realized that it lacked the state capacity to fulfill them unless there were these voluntary contributions by citizens that helped India put its target over the top of these targets. And so I think it's a mixture of this idealism plus realism about state capacity, which really encompasses the idea of democratic planning. So along with democratic planning, another phrase that I found mention of often in official documents is the phrase plan consciousness. What is the level of plan consciousness in the country? And the reason that this was important was that, one, unlike class consciousness, plan consciousness is something that can, that unify people. Class consciousness naturally makes you aware of the distinctions between you and fellow citizens because of entrenched class privileges, etc. But plan consciousness was something that theoretically all Indians could put their shoulders behind. And the extent to which Indians knew about the plans and participated in them was the level of plan consciousness in the country. And I found this phrase pop up often along with democratic planning in government documents from the time.
And you talk about some of the extraordinary efforts which the government went to in order to foster planning consciousness, traveling exhibitions, plays, songs. You also mentioned ballets, operas, Kavi Sammelans, Mushairas, all with 5-year plan themes. And perhaps my favorite, which I dutifully looked up on YouTube after reading in your book, the films division would come out with various films, including one film, an animated film, Shadow and Substance from 1967, where an alien visits an Indian farmer every 5 years to convince him of the effectiveness of the 5-year plans. How effective were these efforts? And that particular animated film was produced in 1967, and that was a long time after the plans had lost a lot of their luster. And as you mentioned, the government itself knew that much of this effort on its part to foster plan consciousness had not been working. Why was it still doing it at that late of an age?
Yeah, you're right that the Indian state puts in a remarkable amount of time, money, and effort behind popularizing the 5-year plans, and it takes these numerous forms. As you mentioned, there was a whole division in the Ministry of Information and Broadcasting called the 5-year Plan Publicity Committee, which had publicity officers, devoted to different districts in the country, traveling for at least 15 days in a month, traveling on bullock cart units, jeep units, boat units, all of them carrying publicity materials with them and a film projector in which, they would put up this sort of blanket, between two sticks and project this little film about planning, including films like this, like Shadow and Substance, right? In inappropriate, and they would be dubbed in appropriate languages across the country. There was also a separate song and drama division, which, as you said, put up these plays and skits and mushairas about 5-year plan themes. There were even university planning forums that were set up across the country. The one surviving one that I know of is in St. Stephen's College, still has a planning forum, which today is just mostly a policy debating club. But its origins go back to the 1950s, where almost every central university in the country had a planning forum, and every college had a planning forum where they were expected to debate aspects about the economic policies, about the 5-year plans, the previous 5-year plan, the fourth 5-year plan. And the idea, again, very idealistic, was that the distilled knowledge and intelligence from the heat of these debates would filter up to the Planning Commission, which would take on board the best suggestions from the future student intelligentsia of this country. There was a plan magazine called Yojana, which still exists today. It has really fallen from its heights in the 1950s, where it was the influential publication edited by Khushwant Singh, to today, where it is mainly used by IAS aspirants in their preparations for exams. It doesn't have any wider cultural influence. But yes, the films division was perhaps the largest documentary filmmaker in the world in the 1950s and 60s, and up to a third or 40% of the films that were produced by the films division related to themes of planning and development. And so an extraordinary amount of films are being produced. Amongst the more entertaining of those is the one you mentioned, Shadow and Substance, of this person, I suppose alien, from an unnamed planet. Actually, not unnamed; it is numerated. We get the number of the planet. Visits, and the visit of the alien is timed to the end of each 5-year plan. And so, though the farmer who this alien is visiting and befriends doesn't really see any changes in his life, from the perspective of the alien, you see how much India has changed, and that's what the film is trying to convey. With every 5-year plan, the life of this farmer is actually changing a great deal. The films meet with mixed success. There's a committee set up in 1967 called the Vidyalankar Committee, which looks into this plan publicity to see if it has been a success or not. Its conclusion is that it is not, quite categorically. But it says that there are some aspects that do better than others. It says that printed literature makes no difference, but that actually amongst rural audiences, the song and drama division, their productions are quite popular, and so are these projected films. So there are some aspects that they say maybe focus on this more than other things. But I think we also might want to look at and think about the broader cultural influence, the influence that is not necessarily promoted by the government, but that just seeps into the popular culture of the time. So one gauge of that, for example, is what is the influence of the plan in literature, in movies. And so, for example, I found that in novels like Jhuta Sach by Yashpal, this one of these magnum opuses of the 1950s in Hindi literature, the protagonist is somebody who is on the 5-year plan, and I suspect, is modeled on a character like P.C. Mahalanobis. Popular plays at the time included things such as Hamara Gaon, which is again about the 5-year plans. There were Bollywood movies like Naya Daur featuring Dilip Kumar, Char Dil Char Rahe, featuring Rajkumar, Shami Kapoor, Meena Kumari. Bollywood songs sung by Lata Mangeshkar, Mohammad Rafi, Asha Bhosle, all talking about the Panchvarsha Yojana or the Yojana, and about how Indians need to be engaged in the 5-year plans. I mean, these are household names today, and these are people who were engaging in very often in non-state propaganda, but because plans were just part of the zeitgeist, they bled into the films of the time as well.
So at one end of the spectrum, you have Bollywood and animated aliens, and at the other end, you have sadhus. As you described, the government of India tried to recruit sadhus for planning publicity, something which went spectacularly wrong in many ways, and which in many ways came back to hurt the Congress party, since many of these individuals went on to do stuff like found the Vishwa Hindu Parishad and embrace early avatars of the BJP. What precisely were government ministers thinking when they came up with this plan?
I mean, I think that with the knowledge that we have today of what became of many of these sadhus, I think that people would say that they weren't thinking, or they weren't thinking long term at least. And I was quite amazed and alarmed when I came across these files, and I couldn't quite believe it, because you don't associate the Nehruvian government, the sort of vaunted government of secularism, with associating with Hindu ascetics, with sadhus, right? But the Bharat Sadhu Samaj was this organization that was established in early 1956 at a meeting at Birla Mandir in Delhi. And in this meeting were about 50 sadhus and some leading Congress politicians, including Gulzarilal Nanda, who was a Gandhian one-time trade unionist. By then was the Minister of Planning, and after Nehru's death, is also a 2-time interim Prime Minister of India, and would also become Home Minister under Indira Gandhi. So the way that this organization worked was that it was instituted on the belief shared by some members of the Congress and these Hindu ascetics, that these holy men would in some way help popularize the 5-year plans amongst in India's devout Hindus. Right, Gulzarilal Nanda was a devout Hindu. So was Rajendra Prasad, the president of the country, and both of them were people who blessed the Bharat Sadhu Samaj. And they felt that a lot of the outreach of the 5-year plans through all these ventures that we just discussed were still that they were avoiding the most potent resource in the country, which is that of religion, and the most emotive resource in the country, which is that of religion and Hinduism, and that there was no reason why the 5-year plans could not be melded with, for example, stories from the Ramayana or the Mahabharata. And so they encouraged this, and they were part of this kind of public-private partnership between the government and this private organization. Private, these sadhus. What was Nehru's role in this? And this, I think, is quite intriguing. Nehru remains very skeptical, and he's deeply ambivalent about it. When he does have a meeting with the sadhus and he does speak to them, he kind of scolds them very often for what some sadhus have been accused of doing across the country. There were a spate of cases that were reported widely in the news about sadhus or fake sadhus kidnapping women, about kidnapping children, about them engaging in violence or in thieving. So sadhus at this time, there was even because of which there was even a sadhu registration bill tabled in Parliament at this time, at the same time that the Bharat Sadhu Samaj is allying with the Congress as well. And because of which this concern was serious enough for the Bharat Sadhu Samaj to actually register every sadhu that was meant to be formally a part of this Bharat Sadhu Samaj. So every sadhu was meant to carry an identity card that that proved that this sadhu was a genuine Bharat Sadhu Samaj sadhu. Right? I mean, not the sort of thing that you imagine these people who have given up a life, their material life, for a life of spirituality and otherworldliness. You don't expect that they would engage with something as crassly material, so to speak, like the 5-year plan. So Nehru remained very ambivalent, but he still, I suppose, did not decide to put an end to it. But what the Congress Party would find over the course of the following years, as you said, is that the Bharat Sadhu Samaj was more interested in policies such as banning cow slaughter, and eventually would play into the hands of the Congress's political rivals, such as the Jan Sangh and eventually the BJP. One of the founding presidents of the Bharat Sadhu Samaj, Sant Tuktoji Maharaj, would become one of the founding vice presidents of the Vishwa Hindu Parishad, and over the course of the 70s and 80s would become a part of the Ram Janmabhoomi movement, and would drag the Congress into areas where it would just naturally lose out to the Jan Sangh and then the BJP.
Yeah, some of these characters sound remarkable. I mean, you mentioned Tukroji Maharaj, who both wanted nuclear disarmament and also wanted China and Pakistan to be nuked by India. I mean, it's incredible what some of these individuals were like, who were recruited for planning publicity purposes.
Right. I mean, I don't think Sant Tukroji Maharaj was the most consistent or sophisticated policy thinker. I think that he had an agenda that was more to do with promoting the ideas of sadhus and promoting Hinduism. And I think it becomes clear when he becomes a vice president of the Vishwa Hindu Parishad. He becomes, part of the, he endorses causes such as that of banning cow slaughter. That's where his heart really is. But because he becomes the president of the Bharat Sadhu Samaj, he's given a stage in which he's allowed to sort of, expand upon topics on which he really, is not really familiar with or does not really have a policy platform on. But, he would be one of the people who, along with the Bharat Sadhu Samaj, would in 1966 launch an attack on Parliament, which led to wide-scale destruction across central Delhi in 1966. It was the first attack on Parliament. It led to, again, ironically, Gulzarlal Nanda, who had once been the patron of the Bharat Sadhu Samaj, losing his job as Home Minister. Because, of course, you can't really be Home Minister in charge of public order in the country and also be seen as the patron of the very people that attacked Parliament.
Absolutely. So as we come to the conclusion of this episode, I want to look at planning from our contemporary moment. So if you look at institutes like the Planning Commission, India's statistical infrastructure, or even the ISI, the Indian Statistical Institute, they're in many ways quite remarkable examples of Nehruvian institution building. But at the same time, I mean, all of these institutes, and maybe to a lesser degree the ISI, but definitely the Planning Commission and India's statistical infrastructure, have either decayed to the point where they no longer exist, or have decayed to the point where people around the world, experts, as you mentioned, people like Thomas Piketty and other individuals like Abhijit Banerjee have questioned India's ability to produce good statistics anymore. So what does the story tell us both about India's ability to create good institutions, but also let them decay at the same time?
Well, I think that the 1950s and 60s were a real heyday for institution building, and we really haven't had a period like that under either Congress or BJP government since. I mean, in the 1950s and 60s, you have the support for the Indian Statistical Institute. The IIMs are set up then. The IITs are set up then. AIMS in Delhi, the medical institution, is set up. ISRO, India's space program, is set up. India's Atomic Research Center is backed and set up at this time. The National Chemical Laboratory, National Physical Laboratory. And part of it is to do with this sort of, Nehru's belief in technocrats and Nehru's belief in science and relationship with scientists like Mahalanobis, Homi Bhabha, Meghnad Saha, C.V. Raman, Vikram Sarabhai, etc. And I think that the institutional decay has a lot of causes. In the decades that followed the 1950s and 60s, there hasn't quite been as much of a commitment to maintaining the quality of these institutions. There hasn't been sufficient funding for things like education and health, of course. There has been a lot of political interference in them, never really allowing them to be truly autonomous. But in the case of the Planning Commission, it's quite clear why the Planning Commission had to go the way of the dodo. It was clear that the Planning Commission was an organization that, as many journalists have reported, Narendra Modi had chafed against as a chief minister who had to go, so to speak, hat in hand every year to the Planning Commission, asking for funds. This was not something that he appreciated, and also the Planning Commission is so closely associated with the Nehruvian era that for someone who wanted to stamp his own mark on Indian history, it was clear that the Planning Commission would go as soon as he became Prime Minister. And the Planning Commission really had also been marginalized by that point, even under Congress government, such that by the 70s and 80s, the real decision-making was taking place in the Finance Ministry. And today, arguably, the decision-making, real decision-making happens either in the Finance Ministry or perhaps maybe just even the PMO, the Prime Minister's office. In terms of what has happened to Indian statistics, I think that along with a new government, a BJP government coming in and want to mark its distance from the legacy of the Nehruvian era, I think that there has also been more recently a kind of anti-intellectualism that has set in, going back to the very beginning of our conversation. The situation with Indian statistical infrastructure is quite alarming at present. Just a few weeks ago, The Economist carried a piece that described India's statistical institutions as crumbling. Right, so this is not from a political party. This is from The Economist. Data journalists like Pramit Bhattacharya have been recording that some of these are long-term issues that go back decades. But there seems to have been an accelerated decline in quality more recently, according to professional economists, such as those you mentioned, right? And it goes from JNU to MIT, from right to left. It includes people like Jean Drèze, but also people who worked for this government, like Arvind Subramanian. It includes former RBI chairperson Raghuram Rajan, Kaushik Basu, Abhijit Banerjee, Angus Deaton, Esther Duflo, and Thomas Piketty, as you mentioned. And I think that what we've found is that, and according to these economists, and this is not my view, this is according to these economists, as I write in my book, I think we've discovered that good data isn't always good politics. And when there were national sample survey results suppressed by the government in 2017, 2018, when the findings were eventually leaked by the Business Standard, it became clear why they were being suppressed, because it seemed to show, at least according to this Business Standard report, that there were record levels of unemployment in the country and declines in household spending. And so the real tragedy is that as a result of this decline in our statistical quality, we don't really have a firm baseline for assessing the levels of Indian poverty or unemployment. And so when the government makes claims about it, it is not to say that it is necessarily wrong, but that we just have no way of independently verifying. Statisticians and economists have no way of independently verifying the robustness of these claims because of the fact that that many of these survey results have either been suppressed or discontinued. And so I think that regardless of the party in power, India's statistical and data infrastructure was something that India could justifiably be proud of. And I think that regardless of the party in power, I think that it would be a shame if that would start to crumble, because it makes it hard for any government in power to pass effective economic policy. And so I would think that it is in the self-interest of any government in power to have a robust and a transparent statistical system.
I think the story that you paint in your book is, in many ways, something that is written across many institutions in India. I mean, many of us tend to blame the current government for institutional decline, but this began much earlier by the Congress in many cases. And you can look across the board, whether it's particular academic institutes or places like Teen Murthy, even for those of us who do archival research there. It's a much longer story of institutional decay that involves politicians from all spectra, and ultimately it hurts everyone, regardless of your political affiliation.
Right. I think there is a sort of short-termism about this sort of kind of political interference in the management of these institutions that doesn't look at the health of the institutions, that needs to outlast governments and individual politicians. And I think that the lack of autonomy for many of these institutions has meant that they have become either fallen prey to the whims of the government in power, or that because offering the directorships of these different, or the leading roles in these institutions has become a sort of prize that governments are able to award their supporters, because of which nobody really trusts these institutions anymore, because now they're just seen as following the winds of political change as well. But I think that along with this political patronage that has done long-term harm to many of these institutions, I do think that, circling back to the beginning of our conversation, that allied with an anti-expert and anti-intellectual backlash has in some ways led to a sort of worsening or acceleration in these trends. And I think that combination could be really dangerous. I mean, the dangers have persisted. And as I said, in the case of India's data infrastructure, the journalist from Bhattacharya has written very well about how some of these problems go back decades. But I think that the fusion, in a sense, of these trends of both of political interference, and now combined with that, a popular anti-intellectualism, that could be really dangerous to the long-term health of many of these institutions.
Absolutely. And this is also a story which involves many other places outside of India as well.
Yes. I mean, this is something that you see in America, certainly. I mean, a country where I work, you see this happening, and you see this as something that Americans are also concerned about. Well, at least one half of America is concerned about.
Exactly. That's a good way of putting it. I mean, I read something recently about Ron DeSantis' government in Florida and how he's managed to politicize so much of the health infrastructure over there, to the point that, the data that we have on COVID coming out of the state of Florida is being questioned by a lot of people. So it seems much larger of a story in many ways. So as we come to the end of this episode, I wanted to talk a little bit about your book and how it fits into the culture of academia that we have in not just here in India, but around the world. For those of us in academia, it's considered an ironclad rule of sorts that one's first published book needs to be boring. And I remember how in grad school in particular, one member of my cohort told me that a boring book, a book that's dull, technical, laced with academic jargon, theory designed essentially to reach a maximum audience of 5 people, only that would be something which would get you tenure. And you've definitely not written a boring book. I mean, you've talked about aliens, you've talked about Lata Mangeshkar, you've talked about Kavi Sammelans involving 5-year plan themes, and the fantastical characters, people like Mahalanobis and Nehru and such. So I really appreciate the fact that you've bucked this trend.
Thanks, Dinyar, but that seems to signal the end of my academic career. So I don't know if I should really be thanking you.
So, I should ask you, I mean, what made you decide to write an entertaining book that, could have appeal beyond those 5 academics? And would you recommend other academics to do the same in their scholarship?
I mean, I think that I should say that I still hope, I hope very much that I have written a book that appeals to both academics and to lay readers. I have tried, and I have try to ensure that I'm as rigorous as any other academic book in terms of the assessment of the research and the literature, and finding ways in which this book not just is a narrative, but makes an intervention analytically into the scholarship. And I think that the issue is that academics and young academics in history are in a sort of bind, right? That the reason I think that first books are often seen as or expected to be boring is because the first book is an emerging young scholar. I mean, I know I shouldn't refer to myself as a young scholar, but given how long PhDs, etc., take, you can be well into your 30s and still think of yourself as a young scholar.
Or 40s.
Or 40s, yes. I mean, forever young, unfortunately, especially if you do not get tenure. But I think that the expectation is that as a young scholar, you're trying to establish yourself in the field and prove that you are a rigorous scholar who has new ideas to present to your colleagues in the field. And so, therefore, often your audience are fellow academics who share with you a similar vocabulary of theories and concepts. And I suppose to people who might be uninitiated in those, it could be boring. But the pull of popular history could also lead scholars to having to sometimes water down the complexity of their ideas in order for it to be accessible, right? I think that it isn't easy to combine the way in which you would prove that you're doing innovative scholarship with having that be accessible to a broader audience. And I think that that is a bind in which many of us scholars are caught in, which is that do you try to expand your reader base? But in order to do that, you need to also have a topic and have insights that are not such that they will need to be first taught a lot of different theories and concepts. And so I think it is very important that all kinds of histories be written. And I think that we're also trained mainly, as you know, as researchers and not as writers for a non-specialist audience. And so I think it is hard
Absolutely.
to write for another audience because it is an entirely different skill that you have to try to hone, and it's not one that we're trained for. And so I don't know if we can necessarily expect every dissertation to do that, and I don't think we should, because also, frankly, not all topics are created equal in terms of how interesting they will be for a popular audience, right? For example, a biography of Modi or Shivaji will right now naturally have a much bigger audience than hundreds of others of important historical questions that you and I would think of as very important historical questions, right? And so in some ways, they're not all treated or created equal, but I do think that all of them are important to pursue. But I do think that academics today are reaching out in many ways. I myself am not on Twitter, but many academics working on a range of topics are on Twitter. Trying to convey their the findings of their works, even if they're writing books that might be mainly geared towards other academics. They are reaching a broader audience through social media, through blogs, through op-eds, through podcasts. I mean, you have a podcast as well now. And thank you for inviting other historians on this podcast. And there are other podcasts on history now that try to convey the information that historians and the analysis that historians have come up with in ways that are not like what you would find in a dense academic book. But I do think that there is tremendous value in those books, and that the hope that all of us historians have is that even though that conversation might be restricted to within the academic community for now, that there are ways in which it will percolate into the public consciousness. I don't know, but I'd be also very curious as to what you think about this question.
Well, I think you're in many ways you're more charitable toward scholars who write in a dense manner than I am. But I think you're right. I mean, obviously, all topics are not created equal. I do think there is a balance that all of us, whether we're historians, political scientists, anyone, needs to strike between legibility and one's technical and one's ability to be a rigorous scholar. And I think especially in history, that balance can oftentimes be quite easy. I mean, ultimately, history is something which should be legible and should be understandable. And the last guest we had on this episode is Linda Colley, your professor from your alma mater in Princeton, and her scholarship I admire greatly because she's done some really path-breaking stuff. She's written a number of books that have been, which have dominated the field in British history as well as global history. And yet, if you read it, anyone can understand what she's saying. I mean, she's read it, she's written it in such a way that it is legible, entertaining, funny, and ultimately informative.
Yeah, Linda Colley is an amazing writer. Yeah,
absolutely. Yeah, so I think there is a balance, and I mean, maybe it's this. My perspectives are colored a bit from my experiences being in grad school and the people I was around, where people really did kind of turn their noses up at anything that was considered, to have relevance beyond, the pearly gates of academia. I do think historians have a bit of a duty, especially historians for places like India, where history just has so much contemporary relevance for good and for bad, to write in a way where it's not kept as kind of this elite silo, and rather something that can influence wider discussion. We all know that India needs as much quality history as it can get, given all the pseudo history that's floating around, especially the pseudo history that's been floating around in the past few years. So I think we do have a bit of a responsibility to kind of make our knowledge and make our writing accessible to a larger group of people.
Yeah, and I think that that's true, and I think that one way in which I see this moving forward is that, thankfully now, due to the internet and the proliferation of outlets in which you can write for a popular audience, I think there are ways in which I do see amongst my contemporaries a very large number of them writing, even if their books are not necessarily geared towards a popular audience, that they are willing to write for online outlets, right? So that they find something that they do think will be of interest, or they're able to summarize some of their research in a way that they think might be of interest to a popular audience, such that they're able to be judged by academic standards, by academics in their academic books, but also at the same time write for an online outlet in a way such that their work also translates to another audience. Because I think that also the strictures of you're right, that the strictures of tenure in academia are such, and I'm speaking here about the American system at least, which is what I am formally a part of right now, are such that there are these expectations that I think are sort of hard to change. But it is also encouraging that senior scholars, like my former advisor Gyan Prakash himself, that they are writing books that are, again, rigorous, insightful, but can also be read by a broader audience, and are being read by a broader audience. And so I think that hopefully this is a shift by which more people feel encouraged to write for broad audiences. But also, I think that whatever your subject matter is, and whatever you think the maximum number of readers you might find, I think that we all, aspire to be better writers, and I think that is something that we can all. And maybe this is something that we should also be looking to do in, graduate training, in PhD training, that we not only train people in the very important aspects of how to navigate an archive, how to assess sources, how to assess the quality of sources, and how to put together these sources in a way that makes a convincing analytical argument, but also how to present it in a manner that might be as elegant as possible, and therefore might reach as wide an audience as possible. So perhaps that is something that, especially with the cratering of the job market, especially in the West, not that India is necessarily better, but it does seem like, at least in India, there are some more institutions that are coming up. It might be a way in which, and I think it is something that a new generation of graduate students are looking to do, because they realize that their careers, though their training might be as that of a historian, that their careers might not be as that of an academic. And therefore, they might need to be able to communicate, will need to communicate with audiences that are not, egghead professors.
I think that's a great idea. I mean, many of our peers, for better or worse, write in a way that is legible only to those of us who've had, 6 or 8 years of training in a history PhD. And I sometimes am a little shocked and kind of ashamed of the fact that, articles which I could not really understand in my first year of grad school, now I can understand, no problem, because I've been trained to read the absolute obtuse and jargonistic language that's employed. But I do think there's a great value in enforcing lessons of clarity of prose, clarity of thought amongst grad students. Because as you say, most of them will probably not stay in academia, given the way that the academic job market has progressed over the past few years. Now, as my last question, I want to ask you, what are you currently working on? I know you're here in India working at the National Archives. What's your current project that you're looking at?
My current project is, which I've just begun. I'm only 2 or 3 weeks into the research is a study of India's cultural diplomacy after independence. In some ways, it's a look at the Indian state's attempts at soft power from independence to the present. I was a few years ago when I was researching this, my first book, I came across some files at the National Archives about children writing letters to Nehru asking for a baby elephant. And as you know, when you come across a file like that, it's such a relief from the utter tedium of going through these indexes at other times that you sort of stop for a moment and make a note of it. And if you have the time, even sort of call it up. And I did, and it led to a sort of magazine piece by me for the Caravan about how there were, these children in Canada, in Tokyo, in other countries that were writing letters to Nehru asking for baby elephants, and Nehru was sending them baby elephants that then lived on to ripe old ages, some into the 2000s, in these different countries. And it generated a lot of positive publicity for India in these countries. And one of the remarks by one of the bureaucrats in those files talked about how the real reason that we need to send these elephants to these countries is not necessarily because these children want it, though that's a sweet reason, etc. But it's because we actually take so much aid from these countries. Like we have wheat loans from these countries. They're giving us grain, they're giving us money, and we are a poor country that's just been decolonized. We have no military might, we have no economic might. The only thing we can do are make gestures like this. And so it sparked the idea of how else has India sought to cultivate some soft power, cultivate a cultural diplomacy from the period of independence to today, for example, when under a very different political dispensation and different Prime Minister Narendra Modi, you still have India cultivating soft power through things such as National Yoga Day, which has now been recognized by the UN, through having at different high commissions in the US, cultural envoys, cultural acharyas, people who are teaching Sanskrit and teaching Indian sort of classical arts in these different places. And so you had in the 1970s under Indira Gandhi festivals of India, which also worked as propaganda during the time of the emergency. And so I think that there are ways in which the Indian state has tried to prop up its soft power across the world through cultural diplomacy. And I think that the question of how third world or developing countries engaged in this arena of cultural diplomacy and soft power is not adequately studied. We know about American soft power through Hollywood. We know about K-pop and Korea's flexing its muscles through through soft power. But I think that the idea that a poor country could also have such aspirations and want to punch above its weight is intriguing to me. And so I'm going to pursue it and see where that goes.
That sounds fascinating. And for me, it's particularly relevant because before graduate school, I lived in Washington, D.C., and I used to go to the Indian embassy for screenings of old Hindi movies. And of course, there would be free food there also. So there was an extra incentive to go as a recent college student. So thank you very much, Nikhil. It's been a pleasure talking to you. Thanks for speaking for a slightly longer period than I anticipated also. And I really want to emphasize, I really loved your book. I think it's a great read. I encourage all listeners to take a look at it, learn about the world of Indian planning, and we'll look forward to what you write after this.
Thank you so much, Dinyar. This was an absolute pleasure.
Thank you.
You were listening to Past Imperfect, a special podcast series by SPJIMR, brought to you by SPJIMR's Center for Wisdom in Leadership, produced by Vinita Dwivedi.